Apologies in advance. It's been a little over 2 weeks since recording, and I'm still recovering from being sick. My voice is not at 100% right now, so apologies if this chapter is going to be a little rough, and I may not be doing voices, which some people may argue is a good thing. Anyway, on to the story. Star Wars: Heart of the Jedi by Kenneth C. Flint. Chapter 7. The silhouetted figure of the Iktar swept across the fiery disk of the larger of Tatooine's two suns. Its spread of shadow flashed over the form of Luke Skywalker far below, skimming the surface of the desert on his hover scoot. He looked around and upward, noting the bird-like creature gliding high above and some way behind him. But his gaze did not hold on this seemingly innocent thing for long. It swiveled quickly back to the way ahead of him. That was of obvious necessity. The vista of even-colored sand looked flat, but it was deceptively so. Low dunes swelled up often and unexpectedly. With the scooter moving at high speed, it needed all of Luke's careful attention and lightning reflexes to swivel hip his way through them. He did this literally, using his body, the simple vehicle having no other steering gear. A left lean or right banked the floating platform, the subtlety of the move decreasing the acuteness of the turn. More and yet more of what seemed endless desert scrolled toward and under him from the horizon as he zoomed ahead. That the search had been a long one was attested to by the fatigue showing in his face, and the accumulated dust coating his clothes. Still, he stared doggedly out across the monotonous landscape of brown sand, wavy with rising heat. Something off to the right of him caught his eye. He looked toward it, blinking against the light. He stared hard and blinked again. Yes, something definitely showed there. Little dusky ovals just visible against the lighter sand. He leaned slightly right and brought the scooter around towards them. As he approached, he noted a higher curve of the dune through a sheltering arm about one side of the odd spots. He altered course to make for this, and put its cover between himself and them. He slowed as he neared the dune, gliding to a full stop at its base. He scanned the scene around him. There was nothing but the arid waste. Still, he was wary as he dismounted from the scooter. He pulled the hood up over his head to increase his camouflage before climbing the sandy slope. Moving slowly and keeping well crouched, he went completely prone as he neared the top, crawling the last yards to the crest on hands and knees. He peered over the dune. Before him was spread a number of what seemed to be wide, circular holes, clustered close around a central, much larger one. His face lit with a smile of triumph. It was swiftly displaced by a grim look of determination. He scanned the area carefully again. Still, there were no signs of life. No beings or machines. Not a footprint or track. Not even a smell or sound save those of baking sand and gusting breeze. He rolled on one side, reaching into his robe and drawing out his blaster. But he paused there, contemplating the weapon thoughtfully. Shaking his head, he slipped it back away. Then he crawled forward. Creeping stealthily, he made his way down the dune's other slope and onto the flat area. He went down again as he approached the rim of the nearest hole, sliding on his belly up to its edge. Very, very cautiously indeed, he poked his head over enough to see down. He looked into a sheer-sided pit over 36 feet across. It was clearly an artificially formed hole, just like that of his old home's atrium. It was just as clearly also a dwelling place. Several openings to underground chambers were visible around the outside of the pit. Some pieces of crude, chiseled stone furniture were set here and there, along with some large pieces of pottery. They surrounded a central plot of darker soil, where a garden of some straggling plants was being cultivated in neat rows. Luke gazed down with open interest at all this, sticking his head farther out to see it better, seeming to forget his risky position here. But a movement below him recalled it to him, and he drew his head back just as a figure appeared from one of the openings. He had a quick glimpse of something rather dumpy and shapeless, wrapped in flowing folds of material bright dyed in purples, yellows, and reds. Then he was edging slowly backward from the pit, preparing to crawl away to a safer position. He stopped abruptly, a look of consternation on his face. His right hand had struck something. His head jerked around. His gaze fell on the thing. It was the toe of a boot. His gaze shot from it up to the length of a robed figure to the grotesque face looming above. Luke got an instant's impression of round, goggling eyes, protruding mouth, and trunk-like tubes running from nostrils to neck, as his hand darted for his lightsaber. But even his reflexes were not quick enough. Before he could grip it, the club end of a stick had swung down, striking his temple a glancing but hard blow. The force knocked him sideways and he rolled over, landing hard, face slamming down into the sand, body going limp. The robed figure stood over him a moment, as if in victory. Then it reversed its weapon. The stick's other end was fitted with a long, slender blade of bright-honed metal. The being used a barb near the point to catch the edge of Luke's hood and draw it back, exposing the human face. Then, the blade dropped lower to press its keen tip to the bared nape of the defenseless Jedi's neck. The human hand slid a slender, socket-like device down firmly over the length of the gold metal finger. The hand of flesh pulled back then, its task complete. All the fingers of the metal one had been fitted with the sockets. From the outer ends of each, coiling wires ran upward. C-3PO could do very little about his hand being treated in this way. The golden droid was, at the moment, being even more than normally restrained. His body was immobilized by shackles about wrists, ankles, waist, and neck. He was held rigidly upright, his back tight against an appropriately tombstone-shaped slab of gray metal atop a round platform. The hapless being was virtually festooned with wires. Besides his other hand being outfitted like his first, there were wires running from odd boots upon his feet and from nodules atop a colander-like helmet contraption on his head. All ran upward to form a thick bundle suspended from a boom whose arm hung close above. The poor droid could move nothing but his head, and that only within a narrow range. Still, this was enough to give him a view of much of the room, and more than enough to confirm that it was a very bleak prospect he faced. The place was apparently a deep basement of some kind, windowless and dank. Its rough stone walls shone with streaks of moisture. A narrow stair angled upward to a single doorway high above. It was a storage room, with crates and barrels of all types stacked everywhere, except in the middle of the floor. Here, a round area had been cleared, and hastily too by the look of the goods that had been piled haphazardly around its periphery. In this open circle sat the platform of the droid, and some 20 feet away a chunky, complex, and rather malevolent-looking mass of machinery. There were also a number of men in the room. All were Imperials. 2 working about the machinery were in dark officers' uniforms. A dozen other were in the white armor of stormtroopers. They guarded the door and formed a wide ring about the cleared area, weapons at the ready. One of the 2 officers was just backing down from the low platform, having made the last attachment to the droid. He was Lieutenant Voss, one of the young aides to High Admiral Tharkus. Voss eyed his handiwork critically, gaze running up to the wires, following them overhead and across, to another support pole and down to where they entered the machine. This unpleasant pile was also a most impressive collection of ugly attachments and protrusions, uncountable switches, buttons, readout screens, and monitors pouring out unknown data, flashing and flickering and stuttering, and pulsing lights forming an unsettling display. "Well, that's all hooked up properly, then," Voss pronounced with great satisfaction. "Don't you think so, Doctor?" The one addressed was an elderly, pudgy little man, with a straggling gray goatee and wild, thinning hair. He worked over his instruments in a most harried manner. At the other man's words, he looked up distractedly. "All? What?" He glanced briefly at the wires. Yes, he said brusquely. "Now let me finish my own work." Voss glowered at him for this short shrift, clearly not very much enamored of the man. The uncaring doctor busily adjusted more controls and punched more buttons. A faint hum of power rose from the machine, growing louder. The screens and displays began disgorging streams of figures with frenzied rapidity. C-3PO stared at this quite fixedly. He spoke up now with a distinctly urgent tone. "Excuse me, sir." The young officer looked around him. "Yes?" "I hate to be a nuisance, but I really must ask, why are you doing this? It was my understanding that you and my masters were not to be enemies anymore. You are about to make peace." You're wrong, droid, Voss responded coldly, striding back to the platform. Only some of us are, or are planning to. And that is exactly why you're here. He stepped onto the platform, thrusting his face up close to 3PO's. We wish to learn only one thing from you, he said in a menacing way. Where will the meeting be? But I assure you, I can't tell you that, the droid told him earnestly. I don't know. An exact location hadn't been arranged yet when I left. Voss cracked a smug little smile and stepped back. Ah, that we were aware of, he casually informed the droid. We believe you when you said you've no idea. You do, 3PO said in puzzlement. But then why drag me down here? Why this? Because you will know. And then you will tell us. I? The droid was incredulous. How? Utilizing this transmitter. Voss lifted a closed hand and opened it, showing 3PO a small disc on his palm, which we will implant in you, and, using a special code, you will send a message to us just as soon as the destination is learned. And just what makes you think I would cooperate in such a treacherous act? The droid said indignantly, pulling himself defiantly up as much as his fetters would allow. Oh, you'll have no choice in that, the smirking Voss replied. He gestured back towards the pudgy man as he stepped down from the platform. You see, our good doctor here is well adept at AIT. Artificial Intelligence Transmogrification? 3PO amplified, fear entering his voice. You begin to understand, droid. Good. Voss walked back to the other man. Yes, the doctor has devised a system that will most effectively reprogram you. You will serve our needs now. I will not, 3PO said stoutly, summoning his courage again. You will. This came from the doctor himself, who had paused in his work to join the discussion. I have not had a failure yet, he said proudly. It will take more than some infernal mind-twisting device to make me betray my companions and the cause, the droid told him. You hear that, Voss? The doctor said with fascination. His cause. And his companions, yet. An amazing amount of human loyalty for a droid. Never have I seen such personality. It's a pity, in a way. 3PO picked up on that. Pity? Why? Because the process will override it in substituting ours, and I'm afraid the alteration is quite irreversible, so goodbye. With that, he flipped a final switch. The humming of the machine increased to a roar. Power sizzled along the mass of wires and crackled from the scores of connectors to the droid. Silver tendrils of energy flickered over his metal skin. His eyes flared to the brightness of twin spotlights. His form shuddered with the immense force coursing through it. The gray slab he was fastened against started to glow, changing swiftly to incandescent white, as if from immense heat. The platform on which he stood began glowing too, and a curved wall of white light, like a translucent glass capsule, rose up from it to surround the vibrating form, hiding it from sight. But out of that column of blinding luminescence there came a single, long, and rising cry of pain. The light was an intense, red-gold blaze that seemed to consume all space. Luke Skywalker opened his eyes and squintingly looked into it. Slowly, his gaze focused. The glow resolved to the light of Tatooine's twin suns right above. He was flat on his back, looking straight into the sky. He stared up in a disoriented way for a moment. Then he turned his head to one side. He found himself looking into the black eye socket of a skull. His eyes widened in shock. It was a semi-human skull that stared back at him, having pronounced brow ridges and small tusks. An enterprising desert spider had taken the rare bit of shelter for a nest, filling its gaping jaws with web. Luke recovered and tried to rise. He found quickly that this was impossible. He struggled a bit harder, but remained flat on his back. Lifting his head as high as he could, he strained to look round. He was now stretched out, spread eagle on the sand, chained hand and foot to metal stakes. He had been stripped down to his trousers, the white flesh of his torso exposed to the merciless Tatooine suns. exposed to something else too. A curious gold goo with a pungently sweet smell had been poured on his chest, and was slowly oozing down his sides. Baran bush sap, he identified in a wondering voice already growing husky from a parching throat. With an effort, he lifted up higher for a broader view. He could see he was in a round open area of hard-packed earth. It was quite flat, except for slender serpentine runs of dune, crisscrossing in the sand sea that lay all about the small island of solid ground. And he wasn't alone there. Spread around him were the remains of many others who had clearly suffered the same fate, which was now meant for him. A score of endo and exoskeletons from various life forms were all staked out as he, not rotted away as by weather and time, not torn apart as by scavengers, just stripped down to their bare, sun-bleached, sand-blasted shells or bones. From this cheerless prospect, Luke turned his attention towards his restraints. He yanked experimentally at the chains. They were of very strong forged links. He examined the metal handcuffs. They were secured by cotter pins at his wrists, beyond fingers' reach. He directed his strength to first pulling a leg stake, and then an arm. His sinewy body grew taut with the effort, as he tried brute force, but the rods were too deep in the hard ground to be pulled out towards him, and the yard-long length of chain gave him no leverage to pull them up. He abandoned this struggle as futile. Of course his belt, including the lightsaber, was gone. He couldn't have reached the weapon with a hand, but he almost certainly could have with the Force. The Force. He looked carefully about him once again, clearly contemplating where that power might best be put to use. His gaze lit on one of the stakes above his head. He fixed his eyes on it, brow furrowing in concentration. For long moments nothing happened, but Luke's focus didn't waver. And suddenly, only infinitesimally at first, the stake began to quiver. He redoubled his effort, face drawing tighter, reaching towards the stake with outspread fingers as if beckoning it to him. It shook harder, loosening itself. His whole body vibrated with the strain. Sped by the movement, a trail of the viscous gold sap ran on down his side. A fat drop of it formed and fell, plopping to the ground in a puff of dust. Heedless of this, Luke strained on. The stake now began to edge upward. It moved only a millimeter at a time, but it was definitely lifting. It was coming out. Another thick globule plashed on the ground. Its moisture absorbed instantly into the arid sand. But a small but peculiar noise broke Luke's concentration. He paused and listened. It was a faint drumming, blended with a hissing sound. He looked around to find its source, but it stopped. His gaze searched the surroundings. There was nothing but him and his wasted comrades. Then the sound came again, this time continuing. He located its direction and stared in growing wonder. In the surrounding sand, a new line of dune was forming as he watched, and it was running straight towards him. The movement stopped abruptly some dozen feet away, on the edge of the hard surface area. The end of the low ridge throbbed, wriggled, and swelled larger. From the sand atop it, something popped into view. It was two bulbous eyes.